Hello and welcome to the Football Unravelled. We're back again after a bit of a hiatus, and today we've got an entertaining episode. So we're going to be considering what impact globalization is having upon football. I think it's a concern that I think many fans are having around the world nowadays, whether you be a legacy fan, a local fan, or maybe a new age global fan. I think we can all agree that the massive global expansion of European football is having an enormous impact on the financial and the competitive structure of the sport. So today we'll be considering what impact this global expansion is having upon football's sporting integrity, but also considering how the global appeal of the sport intersects with local football culture. I think later in the episode, we're going to try and use the case of the Brazilian national team and the Brazilian league as an example of how rampant neoliberalization of the sport across the globe may potentially have eroded the competitiveness and integrity of many non-European leagues. It should be a really good episode, and we've got a really good panel to be starting with. We were going to have a bit of a larger panel today. We invited a few people in. Unfortunately, we weren't able to bring the full panel together. So I think this episode, we're going to take more of a relaxed conversational tone. And I think that probably suits the tone, the type of episode that we want to do. So it's going to be really interesting. We do have, though, our fantastic new contributor for the podcast. So I'm really happy to introduce to you Owen Macdonald. He is a fellow Guardian Below the Line contributor and I would say a part-time political commentator. How are you doing, Owen?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to sharing some opinions with people who I've been watching quite a few times, actually. Like I've seen the first few episodes, so it's really promising. So I'm looking forward to sharing a few.
Great. Yeah, great. It's great to have a fan on as well. You're a Fulham fan as well, right?
I am indeed, yes. Much to my shame. A bit nervous for tomorrow. We've got a very, very, very big game. The League Cup semi-final, so I
think we're all hoping for a Middlesbrough Fulham final, right? But
I massively so.
It doesn't look
like I'm just checking the scores, and Chelsea are 4-0 up at 64 minutes, so it looks like it's going to be Chelsea Fulham. That's a good final.
Chelsea Fulham. That's what we want, Owen.
Yeah, exactly. We beat Chelsea last season, so why not do it again, right?
Exactly.
Come on, Fulham.
I'm thinking that maybe in this episode we're going to be able to dig into some of the issues that the Fulham fan base may be experiencing at the moment. When you think of ticket prices increasing and issues with maybe connect with the fan base and the club, I do think that Fulham may be one of the clubs in the Premier League that can best represent this. I'm happy. I'll be interested to hear your take on that maybe in a few minutes. And then we also have, of course, my father, who's also going to be co-hosting this episode. How are you doing, Dad?
I'm fine, Dan. How are you?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. Yeah, I'm good. It's pretty late for me. We're recording this quite late in the evening for me, but it's good to finally get one of these done again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Shame about the Brighton result last night, wasn't it?
It was. I think Wolves played well. To be honest, I think they played a lot of good football. They had more chances than Brighton in the second half. Brighton had a lot of the ball. It was, it was strange to come away from a 0-0 draw after pretty much not being anywhere near 0-0 draws for the whole half of the season up to now. But
for me, I was watching on the telly from far away. I live abroad. And as an international global consumer of football TV, it was pretty boring. So as a legacy fan, I'd probably assume that you...
It wasn't the best of games, but Wolves played well as an away team. I think they came out of it with a lot of credit, and they probably did deserve the draw, to be honest. And they did with, playing football and not resorting to time wasting or anything. I thought it was all right.
Yeah.
It was okay.
All right, then why don't you kick us off today? I believe you've got one of your world famous historical contextual
man
monologue
ranting
on
at
the
the
topic.
moon type global rant. Well, yeah. So
what do you think, Troy?
I mean, globalization, I guess you could say, started with the British colonialists when they took the game to places far and wide at the turn of the 20th century. But as far as it affected fans throughout the 20th century, there wasn't a huge interest in other leagues. Everybody, basically, most people, supported their local teams, and it was localization really. And although crowds would swell if a big name was coming to town, it was more or less your own team locally. And it was only the late 50s when the European Cup and other trophies began to take shape that you could call something like globalization happening. But even then, when I started following football around the 1970 World Cup, World Cups were wonderful windows into strange places and exotic sounding footballers with magical skills, but they were all, over there. You would never thought that Pele or Jairzinho or Cruyff or Beckenbauer would be playing for Everton or Fulham or Manchester United. It was just a ludicrous thought. They were over there. They played for Ajax or whoever they played for. In Pele and Jairzinho's case, basically Brazil, but we had no idea what the club was that they played for. And, all of the Brazilian 1970 squad played for Brazilian clubs, which I think we'll cover in more detail later. So nowadays, it's completely different. And has it got to the point where the tail is wagging the dog? I mean, the clubs nowadays tend to have more foreign fans than they do legacy fans, or the bigger clubs anyway. I mean, in the old days, people supported their local clubs, and in South Africa, for example, when I lived there, most people had just a local team and a couple of people that had English football teams, but mostly they were Manchester United or Liverpool, but they'd never been to the UK or Europe. Nowadays, young boys and girls grow up in far-flung places in the world like Thailand, Nigeria, Brazil, California. They've never been to UK or Europe either, and they sometimes don't even speak English, but they still fall in love with clubs like Manchester United, Arsenal, Chelsea, etc., and maybe Brighton or Fulham or Middlesbrough, maybe not Middlesbrough. What does that mean, though, for the clubs now? I mean, how does it affect the leagues? Should we be protecting our local cultures, which sounds very reductionist, or embrace the global integration and inclusivity? Basically, is it a good thing or a bad thing? We've now got to the point where the Premier League seems to be the focus of the world, and it never ever was in the past. English football was just what it was. We all supported our local teams, and we didn't really expect people in Japan or wherever to know anything about Newcastle United or whatever. Nowadays, people wear the shirts all over the place. So, at the risk of sounding like an old man shaking a stick at high-rise building as yelling, "These used to be all fields round here," I'm going to pass it over to everyone else. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? And obviously, we can discuss that.
I think that kind of sums up the topic of today's episode.
Bit of a rant.
I think we can all agree that, a bit of a rant, but I think we can all agree that football has a really important power in including people, and inclusivity is something that can be celebrated with it. But there are a lot of financial aspects to this as well. So I think today we'll start off with a discussion about the idea of a global fan and a legacy fan. So I think the term legacy fans has been kind of bandied about a bit over the last few years. I think it was Florentino Perez of Real Madrid who came up with the term when he was trying to convince the world that the Super League was a fantastic idea. But it is, when you consider the difference between what we consider a legacy fan and a global fan, yeah, maybe it's an interesting discussion, and maybe I'm going to pass over to you, Owen. I think you might be able to consider how Fulham, as the local legacy fans of Fulham, may be being impacted by the global pressures for integration.
Yeah, no, I think that I'm quite glad actually that I'm doing this podcast, because I think there's a real Fulham angle that can give us some insight into what's going on with global fans versus legacy fans and globalization in football as a whole. So if we start with just this season, there's been quite well documented protests from Fulham fans because of the extortionate fees that are being charged for tickets at the moment. We have, despite having one of the smallest stadiums in the Premier League, we're charging amongst the highest rates for tickets in the league, which is, like, on an economic level seems quite absurd, right? Like, we're not one of the bigger clubs, so why are we charging such stupendous amounts? And I think there's a lot to unpack there, especially when we think about how the game has changed, since the start of Premier League to now. And I want to give a bit of history as to like what's happened to Fulham that's made these changes happen. So if we rewind to the start of Fulham's sort of current iteration in the top flight, so 2001, the Premier League, while still being a massive brand, was not the biggest league in the world, was not certainly the biggest like football sport league in the world, and was still growing as a brand. It had to be the Barclays Card Premiership then, I think. It had to have a sponsor in the name. And it was still a massively different game to what we saw in the early 90s and 80s. It was nowhere near the commercial giant we see today. And so as Fulham go through their seasons, we're a respectable mid-table club, have a few nice seasons, but never really hitting the heights of your Manchester Uniteds and Arsenals. Eventually, this cycle, as often happens, comes to an end. In 2014, we get relegated. And coincidentally, we change ownership. So we were owned by Mohammed Al Fayed, who took the club up the divisions and established us as a proper Premier League side. And our owner changed to Shahid Khan, who is an American businessman. He owns a baseball team. His son is a wrestling promoter. He is very much the image of the American capitalist, the sort of big money, loads of assets around different ventures, and wants to increase his profile by buying a football club. And it's interesting that in 2014 we left the Premier League, because when we returned in 2018, the Premier League is now this huge entity. So of the UN nations, 188 of those nations have broadcast Premier League games, which is staggering. Only 5 nations in the entire world haven't shown a Premier League game, and they're nations that are, essentially autocratic dictatorships, right? Like it's very much exactly right. North Korea. You're very much an outlier if you haven't shown a Premier League game at this point. Like it's almost like as reliable as finding a McDonald's, or it's water is wet. You can watch a Premier League somewhere, and you can imagine at Fulham, returning from our sort of wilderness years in the Championship, the goal of our ownership is now to establish ourselves as a force, as a respectable Premier League brand, so that we can also gain some of the cash revenue that's being pumped into these clubs. You look at what is happening with clubs like the big Manchester sides and the big London sides, and even smaller sides. I mean, much as I love Fulham, we're not a huge side, and similarly clubs like yourself, like Brighton, I don't have that huge appeal. So they are expanding their operations to the global game, right? So having tours in America, going to the Far East, taking their brand and selling it across the globe, and trying to gain some of the cash flow that these massive sides are seeing, to match the expenditure to raise the profile. And with all this said, at the same time as this is happening, our fans who are going to the games, are being priced out, are being left behind, are being sort of essentially seen as an expendable good, a sign that even though we're the main support of the club, the people who should be at the sort of heart of the club, we're something that can be struck off a little bit. And we said, okay, well, maybe we're going to raise ticket prices, but we're going to be okay, because here is the bursting war chest of advertising money and sponsorship deals and Premier League branding that we're going to get from just being part of this league. And I think that there's a real problem really, where because local fans, and it's not just like, I think when we say local fans, like you sort of hinted at, David, like there's a risk of sounding like a bit exclusive and a bit almost isolationist. Like, of course, like, you know, like there's no malice from us, but like you can imagine that someone might hear that and think, oh, you only think that people of a certain type can be a fan, and absolutely not. Football's for everyone. But when people you have a link to the club, and perhaps, you know, have been going for a long time, or perhaps it's in their family and they want to take their kids to get them into football, and they then go onto the website to buy a ticket, and suddenly like they're having to go well into three and even more sometimes, because like if you imagine you're taking your kids along to the game and maybe your extended family, maybe you want to have a day out, and suddenly you're eating well into your that month's salary. You've lost loads trying to get to something that was once a regular Saturday out.
And do you think? Sorry, carry on.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
I mean, do you think that changes the way you become a fan, though? Because I mean, when I lived in London for 3 years, and I've told Dan this tale many, many times, but this was 1989-90, and I could wake up in the morning on a Saturday morning and just choose that morning which game locally I fancy going to see, hop on the tube, pay £5 or £6 on the gate, go in and watch Tottenham versus Nottingham Forest, or I could choose Queen's Park Rangers versus whoever they're playing, or Millwall, or well, very rarely Millwall, but Brentford. And I went to see all the London teams just basically without having to plan weeks in advance and pay an arm and a leg. And if I'd had a child at the time, I could have, you know, kids could go along with their parents, and it would be just a fairly cheap day out, £5 or £6, the tube, and it didn't have to be a great game. But now you've got to have planned weeks and weeks in advance. You've got to pay an arm and leg for your kid to go along with you. They've only seen the game on the telly. They're not going along to see their local team unless they're lucky enough to have a parent who is wealthy enough to buy them some sort of season ticket. Because that,
I think it's. You go ahead, sorry, Daniel.
No, carry on.
You can go. It's fine.
I think it's actually ironic that you said that, like, it's you hop on a train and essentially you've got a full choice of games across the league, because that choice is still there, but it's a paradoxical one, because you have the choice only if you have the money to be able to fork out, you know, hundreds, essentially thousands every season,
and a planned weeks in advance. You can't turn up on the day. The day I'll go down the road to Highbury or whatever it was.
I also think that the issue is it's season ticket holders and fans who are diehard fans that go to every single game. They are the ones increasingly that are, I think, considered almost, perhaps nuisance is the wrong word, but they aren't considered as commercially profitable by clubs anymore. Because if you sell a lot of season tickets, that takes up a lot of seats in a stadium. And those seats could be taken up by tourists who want to come to visit the city and they want to visit the club, which is really fantastic. But those tickets are more expensive than an individual season ticket for that.
And a tourist, in quotes, will buy more merchandise because they're not going every week. They'll be in the merchandise place, buying the scarves and the hat and the souvenirs, etc. Whereas Joe Bloggs, who goes every other week, he's got all the scarves. He doesn't want any more.
I think obviously none of us here wants to gatekeep football. I think actually one of my favorite aspects about football is the fact that you can travel the world and you can talk about it with everyone, and it's really fantastic that actually we get to enjoy a league which is so well enjoyed around the world. But I think it is a genuine concern by season ticket holders and local legacy fans of clubs that they are perhaps being looked at as an exploitable asset by their clubs now, because Fulham, for instance, they will be looking at their season ticket holders and they'll be thinking Fulham's in a wealthy part of London, and the mindset of most of these fans, the mindset of most real hardcore football fans, the ones who buy season tickets and they go to away games, is that I will do anything for this club. I don't care if I am spending most of my salary on this season ticket. I don't care if every weekend I'm spending traveling across the country, and I don't care if I have to spend loads of money on train tickets and buses, because that's going up in price massively as well at the moment. I will be there for my club. And the fact that and clubs know that. They know that their legacy fans will do this for them. And so they are an exploitable asset, where we live in a world in which clubs now are competing for as much commercial profits as possible. So they will exploit that. And I think maybe that's an aspect where Fulham are doing that to their legacy kind of season ticket holders. And I think there's a shame. Sorry.
It is massively so. Like, I think there's a cruel irony in the fact that we've actually been building a new stand to increase the capacity of our stadium. So the Riverside stand is still not quite finished yet, which is a bit, we can't really help that as much, because we can't predict a pandemic happening. You can't predict the logistics and the issues that arise when you're trying to complete a massive project amidst lockdowns and all of the frustrations that come with that. But if the club were truly acting in a manner that showed they were still caring about still considering the difficulties that are being faced by people that not just like from Fulham but across the football community, right? Fans who are finding it hard to get to games because of, as you say, the rise in the cost of living, transportation, availability to getting away from work, having time to schedule actually going to these games. The fact that so much of the hike in price has been put onto fans has had a really, really negative effect, and has actually harmed the image of the club and severed some of the connections from the club hierarchy to the actual fans, making it have a negative effect at the stadium. Because I think one of the things that is lost when you lose the so-called legacy fans is the actual atmosphere and volume of support at the game. Now, I think the Premier League, for all the bluster and the drama and the idea of having all these amazing players, one of the things that is still very important at any football match is the actual interaction between the game and the crowd. And at Fulham this season, unfortunately, we've noticed that at Craven Cottage, lots of our support has been a bit muted, a bit quiet. And at times it can be a little bit uncomfortable watching. Sadly, I don't live in London. I'm not able to go to games very frequently. But when I watch the games, you can hear that the away team is having a much better response from their fans than the home team. You'll hear ironic cheers when a Fulham player kicks it out of play, which is something that shouldn't be happening really at your own stadium. And you wonder, what's going on? Why are fans so quiet? And in many ways, it's because the core fan base of the club are slowly finding it trickier to actually get to the games. And the sort of tourist element, which is, again, in isolation, if someone wants to come to a game, fantastic. But when the proportion is so great that they're essentially the only people who are able to afford a large quantity of the tickets are people who have the money to come to London and spend quite a lot in one day, you're going to lose that connection to the club that I think is important for any club, for any footballing.
I think partly what that is, though, isn't necessarily unique to Fulham. I often sit there at Brighton and think the home fans are drowned out by the away fans. It takes Brighton to be a goal or two up before you start thinking we can't hear the away fans anymore, and it's the home fans are making a noise. And I think that is becoming the all-seater stadium is part of that, and probably also maybe the tourist element as well, in quotes, and the fact that the core fans are spread out around the ground so much. I think you get the hardcore fans. They go to the away games. They stand together or sit together in the away end, and they will make a massive noise. And I think that, so it's not unique to Fulham, that particular example, but I
think it's a massive case with the top 6 clubs as well, because they have more global fans. And I think I saw a YouTube video of a Liverpool fan moaning about the fact that Anfield doesn't have the atmosphere that it once did. And Brighton have been fortunate enough to play in Europe this year. I was at the Marseille game recently, and Marseille fans really have an atmosphere that they wow. And you do kind of think maybe actually the Premier League-ization of football. Everyone's watching the Premier League, but maybe actually you lose an aspect of fan intensity when it's shared so much. And again, that seems like I'm perhaps gatekeeping the Premier League, which I'm not trying to do. But maybe the Premier League doesn't have quite as much. The fans aren't quite as loud.
It's an interesting point. Leagues. Yeah. No, I think Marseille is they've got quite. I think there's quite a few teams in France actually which have really vociferous, really passionate supporters. And I know, like obviously they have. So you go ahead. Sorry.
All 3 away fans so far, which is AEK Athens, Ajax Amsterdam, and Marseille. They were magnificent. They basically flares and party going on in that corner. Really, really easy and quite dramatic. Really added to the atmosphere 100%. And you don't tend to get that with British fans away. They just don't have that kind of smoke. And the whole thing. They shouldn't be bringing flares into the ground, but somehow they do, and they've all been very spectacular. Maybe that's
it's a double-edged thing, isn't it? Because like, whilst we want you want it to be an atmosphere, and we want there to be passion and a sense of connection between the fans and the club, but I suppose part of the Premier League's history is a response to the things that happened before my time, and I'm not old enough to remember it as such, but the hooliganism and the troubles that we saw in football that preceded the Premier League, and sort of the legacy of fans really not behaving themselves when they go over to Europe. And I suppose, given especially as English clubs were banned from actually going abroad to European games for 5 years, potentially that has had a bit of a thought, like the clubs have had to almost be like, well, we're going to have to be a bit more like policing of how we actually take our fans abroad. And because of the modernization of the vast majority of stadia in the country as well, some of the most passionate fans may have been not lost as such, but like maybe not as core of the sport as they once were, which isn't to say that it's a good or bad thing, or isn't to say that like it's good that for like it's not as though a fan base must be passionate and violent and bad at the same time. Like the two can exist in separate ways, but in if you're gonna de-escalate the tensions that was being seen in terraces in England in the 80s, then part of that unwinding may naturally see a calming effect almost on some elements of the support, and us losing it a little bit. But equally, I think that in other leagues, especially in the French league, where like TV deals are having to be patched together at the last minute, and there's Spanish league's another one where they've put in quite strict measures. Obviously, Barcelona, a huge club, have struggled a bit in recent seasons to actually build their squads because they had to comply with various financial rules. Premier League has some elements of that. I mean, there's been lots of discussion about Newcastle recently and what they have to do with their squad, but at the same time, it's obscenely wealthy compared to all of those leagues put together. You look at any of the finances of British clubs or English clubs rather, and it's like they can blow almost any club, bar like Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich and stuff, out of the water. And so when you've got that much money, you want to maintain that like hegemonic power you've got now, where like I think one of our talking points is about how wealthy our clubs are, that we can sort of look at the best teams in Europe and think, oh, actually, I wouldn't mind having Joao Polina come and play for Fulham. Maybe that's maintaining.
Yeah, maybe that's something that we can talk about then, because from the data that I managed to look up earlier on, according to Deloitte, English clubs now make up 11 of the 20 wealthiest clubs in the world, measured by revenue, and 3 of the top 4. And West Ham now bring in more money than AC Milan. The Premier League earns a total of £5.1 billion in TV rights, which is more than double Serie A and La Liga in second and third place. And yeah, like the concentration of wealth in the Premier League is so it really is stark when you look at the figures. It potentially we're talking about the globalization of football here, but maybe we should be talking about the Premier League-ization, the fact that actually the world is now increasingly looking at the Premier League, and then clubs like Real Madrid and Barcelona, clubs that when I was growing up, they were the clubs. They were the clubs that all the players wanted to go to. Now those clubs are trying to create some kind of Super League in order to claw back a bit of commercial value against the Premier League. So, yeah, I mean, what do you guys think about what the impact of that is?
I think it's a bad thing that it is now, the wealth is so concentrated in the Premier League, and globally, the world's attention is almost all on the Premier League, to the detriment of massive clubs from around the world. And for case in point, it seems now that a player from Ajax Amsterdam will view going to Brighton and Hove Albion as a step up, which is purely
Boca Juniors. Brighton have just got the Barco from Boca Juniors. Sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but we just got Barco from Boca Juniors, and I don't think anyone thought that wasn't a step up. Like, I think the way that we frame our understanding of the football pyramid now is that everyone thinks that's a step up for him to go to the Premier League, but Boca Juniors are massive. We
can go back to that stat about the Brazilian, just as a guide, the Brazilian national team, 1970 to 1978. So up until 1978, basically, all the Brazilian players in World Cups were Brazil-based. And then 1982 and 86, there were two each time that were playing in European leagues. But so they were very, very, very much in the minority. And it started to turn 1990, there were 12 European-based players. And that stayed. So that still meant they were roughly half Brazil-based. And that stayed the same through the 90s. And then you get to suddenly 2006, and suddenly there are just 3 that were based in Brazil. And it's never, ever gone back to anything less than that. Anything more than that in World Cup since. And all of a sudden, for the very first time in 2006, there was one Premier League player, Gilberto Silva, played for Arsenal. And that has suddenly leapt up to 12 in the last World Cup. So 12 Premier League players in the Brazilian squad. It sort of kind of takes the shine off the magic of a Brazil World Cup squad when you know that the player up front isn't a mysterious name like Zico or Rivaldo or Ribeirinho or Jairzinho, but it's actually Richarlison, who you've seen falling over for Everton like 3 weeks before, and it just, and Fred for Man United in midfield. It
takes the luster away, doesn't it? It's almost like
off it a bit.
And the style as well is Brazil in the World Cup used to be. Is it the Ginga style? They had
Benito, right?
Yeah, the specific style that they played, which was really about the individual kind of flair and individual talent.
They call it Samba style.
Samba, right?
Yeah.
But nowadays, you kind of get the impression that they all follow the same kind of Premier League academy kind of training and the Premier League kind of combative and physical kind of approach, and the methodical Pep Guardiola way of getting the ball into the back of the net, and
very formulaic.
Yeah, it's
And what's that
it's
doing to the
homogenizing
Brazilian
effect.
league? And what's it doing to the Brazilian league, where massive clubs like Fluminense and Flamengo and Vasco da Gama and Santos, and they're all Corinthians. They're all big name Brazilian teams. They've all had massive World Cup stars during World Cups in the past. Now they're basically feeder clubs for Europe and increasingly the Premier League. And that can't be much fun for a Brazilian going along to see, you can see your star player coming through at the top of the Brazilian league, and you think, well, next year we'll be off to Barcelona, or even worse, Brentford.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because it very much, like when we talk about the globalization and, like you said, the Premier League-ization, like it follows a very economic model almost. It's very detached from the sort of football that we all love, like the very essence of the sport and the flair and the excitement, and just sort of almost follows like someone's revenue sheet where we just thought, what's the best business model for us to follow? Oh, this one. So you imagine the capitalists at the top of these clubs, every club, have their financial teams thinking, how are we going to sustain our wealth? How are we going to maintain the Premier League's position as the biggest dog in town, right? The biggest game, most money, most eyes watching, and it's by accruing more, assets and capital and resources. And the Brazilian league, obviously, Brazil is a massive country, millions of people, millions of football fans. There's always going to be a constant flow of talent coming out from that country. And in the eyes of the footballing public, it's like we say, the image of Brazil is so entwined with football that it's almost like there's like a part of you that gets excited when you see them at the World Cup, just because it's the yellow Brazilian football shirt. Even after all the stuff we've seen, like with the sort of European-esque tactics and the perhaps cynical nature, I feel like players like Neymar don't quite carry the same popularity as like even just like Ronaldinho from a few years ago, right? Like he's a bit different, but there's still that spark of excitement. But from a purely business point of view, it's like clubs like Brighton and Fulham and all these clubs that are in the Premier League money pile, they want to take these assets as quickly as possible. They want to make sure that they're taking an exciting name, almost cashing in on the excitement of Brazil, and sort of putting like a new exciting talent in front of the Premier League audience to get the viewers all back. Probably rake in a fair few viewers from Brazil, because that's a country with a lot of football fans, right? Like they're getting the TV deals too. So it's like they're using purchases and buying players almost to increase the market share in a certain country. Like if you look at obviously Son Heung-min is a fantastic player and he's an amazing footballer, but he's also helping Tottenham Hotspur capture South Korean fans and making sure they stay loyal to the brand, right? And then you look at how many people in South Korea now follow Tottenham Hotspur and how much they make from sales of merchandise and tickets and tours to Southeast Asia. And suddenly there's a massive business opportunity. Like it's sad that something that should be like purely just a fantastic, really entertaining footballer, quite a nice guy from all accounts as well, has gone to go and play in, we're lucky to get him in our league, right? But it's almost, from a business point of view, it's just like, well, he has helped us capture X number of viewers in the market and he'll help us secure these sponsorships, so we'll do it for this reason. And I feel like decisions like that from a purely capitalistic point of view are the reason globalization, despite the potential for it being fantastic, can be seen as more like a Premier League-ization, just a taking over of commodities by our all-consuming league at the expense of the actual footballing element of it and the nations that don't get to enjoy the wealth that the Premier League commands.
Certainly,
Brighton Albion are quite big in Japan because of Mitoma, and there's an awful lot of Japanese fans at the Amex on match days, and which is good. But if we sell him, they'll be off to wherever he's gone. If he gets to Tottenham Hotspur, they'll be all at Spurs rather than following Brighton and Hove Albion, which I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it changed to the way football used to be consumed. It was
it's maybe less romantic in a certain way to think that, you know, a player is not just their skill set on the football pitch, and it's about kind of developing that kind of skill set. It's also about the business opportunity of capturing the South Korean market or the Japanese market. You know, just looking at a couple of stats here. So in 1992, when the Premier League was formed, there were only 13 foreign players in the league, and today there are 371. And I think that accounts for about 66% of all Premier League players. I was also looking at a couple of stats from Brazil as well. In 1970, Pele, who was 29 at the time, he was the highest paid football player in the world, and he made, just from football alone, $144,000 a year. And at the same time, Bobby Moore was making about 60,000. Eusebio and George Best, they were earning about 100,000 each. And nowadays in the Premier League, De Bruyne is the highest paid, and he earns about 400,000 a week, about 20 million a year. Haaland earns about 375,000 a week. Apparently, his bonuses push him up to about 850,000 a week. And I was looking at the highest paid player in Brazil, and it's a guy called Gabriel Barbosa, and he has a weekly wage of £59,000 a week. It's about a yearly wage of 3 million. Now, that's a lot of money, but that's less than a lot of championship players now. And, you know, I think it's impossible for... I can't think of... If a player was to stay in Brazil, would they become Pele? Would they become Neymar? Or would they even become Richarlison? You know, I don't think we would really even consider them quite as romantic or exotic in the same way anymore.
Nowadays, they seem to have to go to Europe, and in the last, as you say, it seemed to be about 2018 or around about then. Increasingly, they seem to have to go to the Premier League or Real Madrid. I think there are three other places. There's Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, Barcelona. 4 other players, PSG, and the Premier League. And those 4 other clubs and the Premier League, I would argue.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's such a concentration of wealth in such a remote sort of places.
And I think that's a bad thing. I think I liked the old days where you had teams like Steaua Bucharest coming through and getting to the European Cup final as it was then, and PSV Eindhoven could win it, and there were little romantic stories. Benfica were a big name, and now Benfica basically are, you know, they Tottenham's feeder club almost. I mean, exactly.
Which is sad because we're talking about one of the biggest clubs in Portugal, exactly. A Champions League winner, the home of Eusebio, right? Like it's a storied historical club, and it's essentially like you say, just.
I like that whole thing where you went into European competition, which was a rare thing, and you played European teams, and they were great or good or they were rubbish, but there was a whole variety, and it was a big thing to get to the final. And it almost feels like now, and I might be wrong, and Premier League teams now expect to be at the top end of European football now because they are richer and have the best players now, and that is not good. I mean, it works in many ways. It's bad. It also works. It's starting to come through in terms of teams relegated to the Championship as well. I mean, the top 3, I think at the moment, top 4 in the Championship, with Ipswich stuck in the middle, are the 3 that went down. The bottom 3 in the Premier League are the 3 that came up, and we're going to start to get to a point where teams are going to be just going up and down because
it's going to be
like Premier League plus 5 or 6 teams that are like just switching places with them all. Obviously, I can only say, as a Fulham fan, and we're fairly used to coming up and down. So we're somewhat guilty of this, benefiting from parachute payments ourselves. But
that is true.
But I think it's getting worse. It's worse now than it was 5 years ago, I would argue. I mean, Brighton came up and it really was touch and go whether they would be there for more than a season or two.
I think also it's.
I kind of fancy Brighton's chances if they did go down to come straight back up here. And look at Southampton; they were a mess last year, and yet there they are in 4th position or 2nd. Is it? Anyway, they're in the top 4. And
I think.
Yeah, it's like a very the policy of these the organizations that play here are almost like protecting themselves, right? Like they've made such a fortune that it would not benefit themselves to see this fortune shared out more equally. So the rules
sport isn't protectionism. Sport is the opposite.
It shouldn't be, should it? But the financial interest has become so great in football that the element of corporate activity is so important now to the game that it's the driving force of any decision taken. Like you look at the Champions League, which is an ironic title because not many of the clubs in it these days are actually the champions of their leagues. It's going to be 4, potentially 5 clubs from the English Premier League are going to be in the Champions League next season, depending on whether they gain an extra space. Of those teams, they're all going to be sides that have huge fortunes, going to blow any side out of water.
And they get richer on the back of it.
Yeah,
I think
you mentioned as well. Oh, sorry, you go ahead. Sorry, Dan. You go ahead.
I was just going to say, the disparity as well is obviously, we all know it's felt within the Premier League and within English football as well. And I think that is obviously because the big clubs do get all the TV deals and they do pull in all the global fans. I was recently at a conference and I was chatting to 2 guys. I can't remember where they were from, but they weren't European, and they were an Arsenal and a Man United fan. And one of them said to me, me and my friends wonder somehow how people can be fans of clubs like Brighton or and like not a top 6 club. And then they were saying, but it's nice to meet kind of a fan like you. And I kind of thought, we finished 6th last year. I think, but
you were polite.
I can understand. Yeah, I was obviously polite, but also I understand why he feels like that, because if you are from, I don't know where he's from, but let's say he was from Thailand or anywhere in the world. Thailand was literally a random country that I picked, but let's say he's from Thailand and you're really into football and you're watching the best football product in the world, which is the Premier League. You're not going to pick Brighton or Fulham. You're not going to pick Sheffield United. You're going to pick Man United or Chelsea or Arsenal because they are probably the easiest clubs to fall in love with, because the storylines and the rivalries at the top are more. They get more attention and there's more at stake, arguably. And then that means that these top clubs, they hoover up all these global audiences and they hoover up all these TV deals, and they get more shirt sales, more merchandise sales. And it means that nowadays, clubs like Brighton and Fulham, to compete with clubs like Chelsea, Arsenal, Man United, they have to raise their season ticket prices. They have to exploit their local loyal fans financially, because it's the only way that they can compete with the big clubs. And then you kind of wonder, well, what is the realistic ambition for those kind of clubs? Because they're never going to be able to compete realistically with Man City, Man United, Arsenal, Chelsea. And I think that is a byproduct of this kind of global expansion of the game, which again, I'm going to caveat by saying, I love the fact that everyone gets to enjoy the Premier League and everyone gets to enjoy football, but it is potentially impacting aspects of financial integrity within the game. The fact that these clubs have so much more resources than the others. Don't know if you guys concur with that.
I think that's a fair point. I think exponentially, the more fans the big clubs get, the more money they get, the wider the gap will be between them and the rest. And I think we're becoming more stratified by the year in football, which is a bad thing. Nobody now seriously would predict that anybody but 4 or 5 clubs could win the Premier League, and admittedly that's more than in other leagues, but even that's probably only 3. But I'll just change the subject slightly, or bring it on to maybe some good points of, or are there any benefits to the Premier League-ization of football? Is international football therefore getting the benefits from this by players who would have played in their own leagues, not really developed around the world to the same degree? They come over to Europe and they play in top European leagues and increasingly the Premier League, as we've discussed. And we're now getting World Cups in which Morocco are reaching semi-final, and Morocco are reaching the semi-final.
That is a trend. Yeah.
Japan do reasonably well in most World Cups. They're always a good watch, and there seems to be, there are players now that, because they're being trained at the top level in a league like the Premier League, and then they're going back and playing for Morocco, let's say, or Croatia or whatever, and these teams are actually really good teams with well-trained players that are actually quite good in World Cups now. I mean, they've am I being a bit patronizing, or is that a fact? I think
it's very it's a very good point. Like, it's for all the ills of the globalized game, there is an argument that they could make back, which is that undoubtedly summer of football is amazing. Like the last World Cup, all its problems considered, had some genuinely thrilling. Japan beating Germany, Japan beating Spain, the Morocco taking their way to a World Cup semi, first African nation. But exactly right. Yeah. Like, so many examples of the gap between nations that are smaller, and the sort of the traditional powerhouses of football shrinking so much. But like, you've got teams like Croatia now able to. I know Croatia are a European country, but they're still like a much smaller footballing nation. Like, and they're able to get themselves to 2 consecutive medal places at a World Cup. But I think the thing to consider is that whilst all these countries are able to grow their game at a national level, the consequence of it being so through the lens of a Premier League and at the benefit and behest of Premier League clubs, and I suppose also the big European clubs being able to dictate what happens, is that the game that is left behind in the original nation is much, much worse for it. So you mentioned at the start of the podcast the health of the South African game. African nations do not have the same funds remotely close to European nations, and to South American nations, maybe not quite as financially unequal as African nations, but still, as we mentioned a second ago, Brazilian clubs can't afford to keep the players because they're either snatched away by European giants, or a European club says, well, we'll give you however many $1 million, and they have no choice but to accept, because like, it's more money than it will fund the club's operations for several years. And the criticism, I think, of the globalization is that whilst it is fantastic seeing these nations, it's very much the icing, a thin wedge of icing on the cake. And the majority of the cake is leagues that can barely afford to operate themselves, with dwindling fan bases and supporters that aren't there because they're watching the Premier League. They're not invested in the domestic product that they have on their doorstep, because it can't compete with a league that's just infinitely wealthier.
I had a conversation with an old South African friend of mine who watches this pod. I found out, so he's not that old, and we were talking about the decline in South African football, because basically early 90s we just thought that once apartheid had gone and South Africa would be invited back into the international fold, they'd become a bit of a force in football, not a massive force, but at least competitive in World Cups and things. And that seemed to be the case for the first few years. And 96, they won the African Cup of Nations, and they were runners up in 98. They reached the 98 World Cup, reached the 2002 World Cup, and then it all just, the wheels just fell off, and they've, you know, gone massively backwards. And I was asking him really why, and he was talking to a few friends who are journalists and have actually contacts in the game. And there's various things. One is massive corruption, where the people running the game in South Africa totally mismanaged. But one point leapt out of me, which was because the local football league, the PSL, is financially stable, strangely, the players don't have an incentive, or don't feel the incentive, to go abroad to play. So they never develop outside. And they're almost blaming the lack of globalization for South Africa as a national team deteriorating. I mean, I must admit, I don't think the clubs are doing that well either in African competitions, but they feel there's almost the case that they're not being trained. They're not getting the benefits of the rest of the world going to the Premier League, and therefore South African players just look clueless on the international stage.
They can't access
the way that
the elite.
Yeah, I mean, in the 90s and early 2000s, there were loads of South African players who were playing for various Premier League teams and European teams. Benny McCarthy and Lucas Radebe and Stephen Pienaar, and they were all highly thought of.
Who's that teenage guy?
Teenage Ladler. No, he was in the 70s.
Yeah, I know.
He was already in his 30s, and we were still calling him Teenage Ladler. But
yeah. I think
it's almost as if. So sorry, just to finish. It's like
sure.
They didn't get, if they don't go abroad, and the same criticism is often held against English players. They don't go abroad enough to gain that extra international sharpness and the bit of nous that you get from playing abroad, which is starting to hopefully change again for English players. But the same South African players aren't getting that, and that's one of the reasons, apart from the massive corruption and the total mismanagement, and it's being run by a guy who's accused of various misdemeanors, etc., etc. But it's quite interesting that globalization, or the lack of it for South African players, is given as a reason for that.
And I think, you know, we've touched upon this earlier. In that sense, yes, there's a benefit to countries sending their players to the Premier League, to the Premier League academies, and learning how to play this methodical kind of Premier League kind of way of playing, where the best trainers, the best coaches are. But then, as we kind of touched upon earlier on, there's less of a romantic, exotic difference within World Cups, and you know that can be that comes even down to the fact that, you know, when you look at clips from old World Cups, you know which World Cups you're looking at almost immediately. You know, the Mexico World Cup had the weird, the goals were all a bit strange, and the pitches were all a different color, and then you know every World Cup kind of looked a bit different. But nowadays they all look the same, and all the pitches and all the goalposts look the same, and the teams
plastered in McDonald's and like just the same advertisers.
And you get less kind of crazy scores, and you get less. You maybe get more competitive games, but you get less kind of difference between the way that teams play. And as we said before, you know, you don't see this kind of really exotic, romantic way that Brazil play, and you see all these amazing players that you've barely heard of before. You see all of the Premier League players that you're used to, and you see them playing in the same way that you see them play every week, you know. But maybe that leads to more competitiveness, and then that maybe also leads to the fact that, you know, last year there were 2002 there were two African teams that made the got out of the groups, and there were 3 Asian teams that got out of the groups, and that hadn't happened. There wasn't a single African nation or a single Asian nation, I think, to get out of the groups until 1986. So there is an element of that. Yes, it improves upon competitiveness. We might be improving the standard of players, and we may be including more countries around the world into this kind of high quality type of football. But we also might be losing the romance and the difference, perhaps a little bit.
And I think we're losing the romance, certainly in terms of competitiveness across the broad mix of different clubs from all parts of Europe playing in European competition, and many of them having a good chance of winning it. It's now probably, the odds are we're going to have one of the 4 I mentioned outside of England, and then one of the 2 of the big Premier League teams. All in
England
the
will win.
final.
England will win the World Cup in the next 10, 15 years, I think. And I think that's not because I'm hopeful or romantic or optimistic. I think that's just because we've got all the money, and it's boring. That is boring. And similarly, Dad, you grew up as a Newcastle fan. You probably would have dreamt of Newcastle winning a league title at some point in your life. They will win one in the next 20 years, probably. They probably will win one, but that's not romantic. They have all the money. Like it's that's why England will win the World Cup, and it will be depressing that they'll do that.
Hollow victory.
We're going to burn all our scarves now because there's no point.
Yeah. I think maybe on that note, we might have to start closing up, because it is past midnight for me, unfortunately, at the moment. So, but I think we've had a really good chat, and I think we should also end on the idea that gatekeeping in football is never allowed, and it will not never allowed, but it's gatekeeping is something that we should look out for as well. You could argue that it seems like our discussion is telling people around the world not to kind of follow the club that they love, and that's certainly not the case. I really think that someone from China or Africa or anywhere around the world, if they are in love with Man United or they're in love with Arsenal and they've idealized the players growing up, then they should. It would be wrong to tell them not to support that club, because that's their club. But
I always think that some of the most. Sorry, I interrupted you. I always think that some of the most interesting conversations I've had about football, I've been with Fulham fans from Argentina, from across the Atlantic and America, from all around the world, and that rather than rob the opportunity for them to support a club that I love and that they love as well, we should be aiming our criticisms at people who operate the game at the highest level and make it so that the enjoyment of the game is all through a lens of corporate greed, essentially what it is, corporate greed and financial superiority that ultimately poisons the game that should be for everyone. Right? That's how I've always seen it.
The answer, I think, probably then is, a regulator, but maybe we could go further than that. We need to implement some kind of socialist utopia into football, remove all the money from football, and disperse money around the world, in which every country and every league and every club has an equal footing within the footballing pyramid. Dad, you can have the final word.
I'd love to get back to the days when teams could come out of nowhere and do really well. And it just doesn't really seem to be on the cards anymore. But let's end on an upbeat note.
Yes.
Tomorrow, Fulham could.
Yes.
I'll be crossing my fingers. I may shed a tear if Fulham actually do manage to pull it off. My head says no, but my heart will beat on.
We'll all be watching this. Hopefully, I get this episode out before the game. But maybe people are going to be watching this already knowing the score. But next week we've got another episode planned. We are going to be doing an episode on the importance of rivalry in football. Owen, you're going to be coming back for that. I think you're going to be in. Yeah, I think you're going to be in somewhat of a mediator role for this episode, because we're also bringing in a friend of Dad's who's a Palace fan, And we're also bringing in another guy. He's called Joe. He's a Brighton fan. And I think we're going to be looking at rivalries in sport through the lens of the Brighton and Crystal Palace rivalry. And that is a perfect time because that game is just a few days later. So I would encourage all of our listeners to come back and listen to that episode. And I'm also just going to say, Owen, I think you had a really good debut, reminiscent of Alan Shearer in the 1991 scored a hat-trick.
A lovely comparison. I was in great company though.
1988.
1988. Yeah, thank you everyone. Cheers, Dad. Cheers, Owen. It's been a really good discussion, and see you all next time.
Thank you. Cheers, Owen.
Bye.